The moonlight danced on the restless waters of the Atlantic, casting its silvery glow over the jagged cliffs of Portugal's coast. Waves crashed against the rocks, their unrelenting rhythm echoing a story of persistence and resilience. This was a land forged by struggle, where the echoes of battles and whispers of dreams had intertwined to create something extraordinary. Portugal's spirit was not born in comfort, but in the fierce grip of survival and the bold pursuit of the unknown. In the shadow of Moorish strongholds, generations of Portuguese people fought to reclaim their homeland during the long years of the Reconquista. It was a time of fire and steel, of communities bound together by the hope of freedom. This struggle wasn't just about territory, it was about identity. They carved their nation from conflict, their hearts hardened by centuries of war, but softened by the yearning for something greater. By the time the last Moorish stronghold fell, Portugal was no longer a land of small, divided fiefdoms. It was a country bound by shared triumphs and a longing to define itself in the vast, mysterious world beyond its shores. The restless coastline of Portugal shaped not only its land but its people. The Atlantic Ocean was a constant presence, both a barrier and an invitation. The wind carried the salty scent of possibilities, stirring imaginations. The jagged coastline, with its countless coves and harbors, whispered promises of distant lands and untold riches. Fishermen cast their nets into its depths, bringing back not just fish, but tales of distant waters. Children grew up with the sea as their companion, their minds filled with dreams of what lay beyond the horizon. The land itself seemed to encourage the act of looking outward. With its rivers like the Douro and the Tagus winding toward the sea, Portugal naturally turned its gaze toward the ocean. Its relatively small size meant that the great unknown was tantalizingly close, a constant reminder that there was more to the world than the hills and valleys they called home. Here, the seeds of ambition were sown, nurtured by curiosity and necessity alike. But dreams alone don't shape destinies. They need leaders to give them form, to turn fleeting thoughts into lasting change. In Portugal's history, there was no leader more pivotal in this transformation than Prince Henry. History knows him as the Navigator, but he wasn't the sailor braving the unknown seas. He was the mind behind the movement, the architect of an era that would change not just Portugal but the entire world. Henry wasn't content with what he knew. As a child, he had listened to the tales of travelers who spoke of golden lands and exotic spices far to the east and south. These weren't just stories to him, they were challenges. As a young man, he watched as Portugal captured Ceuta, a glittering city on the North African coast. It was there he realized that riches weren't merely dreams, they were real, tangible rewards for those bold enough to claim them. But Ceuta wasn't enough. The city's walls couldn't contain his ambition. He wanted more knowledge, power, and an understanding of the vast world. Henry surrounded himself with thinkers, cartographers, and sailors, building a school of navigation at Sagres. Here, maps were drawn and ships were designed with one goal, to push the boundaries of what was possible. The caravels, with their nimble design, emerged as symbols of Portugal's daring. Small but sturdy, they were crafted to dance with the wind, to embrace the unknown. Henry's vision wasn't merely about trade or conquest, it was about learning. He dreamed of finding a sea route to the riches of Asia, of mapping the mysterious African coast, and perhaps even discovering the legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John. Each expedition he sponsored carried with it the hopes of a nation and the weight of his relentless drive. The sailors who set forth on these voyages knew they might never return, yet they went willingly, fueled by a sense of purpose and a deep trust in the vision of their leader. The results of Henry's efforts were remarkable. His ships reached farther south than any had before, hugging the coast of Africa, discovering the Madeira and Azores Islands, and bringing back not only goods but knowledge. Each success ignited more ambition, each failure taught invaluable lessons. The tides of history were beginning to shift, and at the heart of it was a prince with an unquenchable thirst for understanding. The ocean had always been there, vast and indifferent. But now, under Portugal's determined gaze, it began to yield its secrets. The horizon no longer seemed like an end, but a gateway, a threshold waiting to be crossed. There was a sense that Portugal's story was just beginning, written not on the land, but on the ever-changing face of the sea. The sky stretched endlessly over the horizon, a deep blue ocean meeting it in a shimmering line of mystery. For centuries, sailors had looked out at that horizon, their hearts torn between fear and wonder. The sea was both a promise and a peril, a place where dreams could be lost or found. Yet now, in a small, determined kingdom on the edge of Europe, men were preparing to challenge the unknown like never before. In quiet harbors and bustling shipyards, the smell of fresh timber and tar filled the air. Craftsmen worked with precision, their hands shaping something extraordinary, ships that were unlike any the world had seen. These vessels, the caravels, were more than just machines of wood and sail, they were hope itself, crafted to withstand the unpredictable tempests of the Atlantic and to dance with the stubborn winds. Their triangular lateen sails caught the breezes in ways older ships never could, allowing them to cut through the waves with grace and purpose. Their sleek, nimble design made them faster, lighter, and capable of venturing farther than anyone dared before. But it wasn't just the ships. The stars above, eternal and unchanging, became the sailors' allies through tools like the astrolabe, which allowed them to measure their position by the heavens. Compasses, once rudimentary, now offered reliable guidance, pointing unerringly north as if to say, "This way, trust me." Maps, once crude guesses scrawled on parchment, grew more detailed and ambitious, their edges daring to outline lands unseen. These tools weren't just innovations, they were the keys to unlocking the vast unknown. And so, the voyages began. Small fleets of ships, their sails taut with wind, slipped from Portuguese harbors and into the endless ocean. The African coast, stretching southward like an unbroken ribbon, became their guide. Each stretch of coastline revealed new landscapes and new challenges. From golden sands to dense, green forests, Africa's shores whispered both danger and opportunity. At times, the sun blazed so fiercely that it seemed to melt the horizon itself, while at other times, the ocean's rage threatened to swallow the ship's whole. The sailors pushed on, driven by more than just orders. They carried within them a mix of fear and faith, believing that their sacrifices were part of something greater. With each mile they charted, they didn't just navigate uncharted waters, they challenged the boundaries of human courage. For the first time, they crossed the dreaded Cape Bojador, a place that had long been shrouded in terrifying legends. They discovered the lush Madeira and Azores Islands, their volcanic peaks rising like emerald beacons from the sea. But the African coast held more than just beauty. It revealed thriving kingdoms and bustling markets, places where gold gleamed and exotic spices filled the air with their heady scent. Portuguese traders quickly realized they weren't the first to seek fortune here. African merchants had long commanded these lands. It was a meeting of worlds, where alliances were forged, and sometimes, trust was betrayed. The caravels brought back not only goods, but tales of cultures as rich and complex as the stars above. As Portugal's expeditions grew bolder, so did their ambition. The Atlantic was vast, but it wasn't enough. Eyes turned toward Asia, where the fabled wealth of the Indies beckoned. Yet this thirst for expansion could not remain unnoticed. Spain, Portugal's neighbor and rival, was also reaching outward, its own explorers crossing oceans and claiming lands in the name of their crown. The world was big, but not big enough for two empires to expand unchecked. So, in 1494, under the watchful gaze of Pope Alexander VI, Portugal and Spain sat at the negotiating table. The result was the Treaty of Tordesillas, a bold agreement that split the globe into two spheres of influence. An invisible line was drawn through the Atlantic, granting Portugal dominion over lands to the east and Spain control of territories to the west. It was a staggering act of hubris, as if these two nations believed they had the right to divide the entire world between them. For Portugal, this treaty was more than just ink on parchment. It was a gamble, a promise of a future they had yet to claim. They now had the official blessing to push farther along Africa, to round its southern tip and find the sea route to Asia. Yet the treaty's implications were immense. It assumed that lands already inhabited by ancient civilizations could be parceled out like spoils, a mindset that would shape the centuries to come in ways no one could have fully understood. The sailors who ventured forth after the treaty carried this weight on their shoulders, though they may not have realized it. Each mile south along the African coast, each skirmish with local rulers or rival fleets, and each storm weathered at sea was not just about trade or conquest. It was the unfolding of a story that was larger than themselves, a story of ambition, of the human need to reach for something greater, even when the cost was unknown. The sea, vast and untamable, had always been there, a silent, indifferent expanse. But now, it began to yield its mysteries to those bold enough to face it. And Portugal, this small nation on Europe's edge, was no longer a mere speck on the map. It was becoming a force that would shape the very fabric of the world. The horizon shimmered with heat, the air thick with the mingling scents of salt and earth. Waves lapped against the hulls of Portuguese caravels as they anchored near unfamiliar shores, their sails sagging in the still air. For the sailors aboard, this was a place that felt both alien and alluring. West Africa stretched out before them, its golden sands glowing under the sun, its dense forests whispering with secrets. This was not the edge of the world, as some had feared. It was a land teeming with life, opportunity, and unimaginable wealth. The Gold Coast, as they would come to call it, was a land that pulsed with vitality. Markets thrummed with activity, filled with the chatter of merchants who traded in gold, ivory, spices, and other treasures. Portuguese sailors marveled at the sight of intricate textiles, glittering ornaments, and the proud, self-assured kingdoms that ruled these lands. Yet, it wasn't just the goods that captured their attention, it was the people. The African kingdoms they encountered were not primitive or unorganized, as some Europeans had imagined. They were sophisticated, their rulers commanding respect with their wealth and influence. At first, the Portuguese approached cautiously, their intentions masked by polite diplomacy. Gifts were exchanged, alliances were forged, and tentative steps were taken to build relationships. Trading posts began to dot the coast, simple wooden structures at first, growing into fortified outposts that bristled with cannons and ambition. Elmina Castle, one of the first major structures, stood as a symbol of Portugal's foothold in this vibrant land. From its walls, Portuguese merchants controlled the flow of gold and goods, their fortunes swelling with each passing ship. But beneath the bustling trade, a shadow was growing. At first, it began quietly, an exchange of captives taken in local conflicts, traded to Portuguese merchants in return for European goods. These captives were loaded onto ships, their chains rattling as they were forced below deck. They were no longer warriors or farmers, no longer mothers or sons. They were now commodities, bound for a fate far from their homeland. The transatlantic slave trade, still in its infancy, was taking shape. The Portuguese were not the inventors of slavery. For centuries, African kingdoms had engaged in their own forms of enslavement, often as a result of war or punishment. But the scale and intent were different now. The demand for labor in distant colonies, particularly in the sugar plantations of Madeira and the Canary Islands, created an insatiable hunger for human lives. It was a trade fueled by greed, justified by ignorance, and sustained by the suffering of millions. In the villages and kingdoms along the coast, the arrival of Portuguese ships brought both opportunity and tragedy. Local rulers, eager to gain European weapons, textiles, and other goods, saw the trade as a way to consolidate power. But not all were willing participants. Some resisted, their warriors clashing with Portuguese forces, their lands burned in retaliation. Others watched helplessly as their people were taken, knowing that resistance would bring only more violence. The ships that carried gold and goods to Lisbon now returned laden with captives. Men, women, and children were packed into dark, airless holds, their cries muffled by the creaking timbers. The journey across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, was a nightmare of suffering and death. For those who survived, a life of forced labor awaited, far from the familiar lands they would never see again. Yet even amidst the cruelty, there were moments of humanity that refused to be extinguished. On the shores of Africa, communities mourned their lost members, refusing to let their memory fade. In the holds of the ships, captives found ways to resist, through quiet acts of defiance, through songs and prayers that carried fragments of home. And in the markets and castles along the coast, there were those who questioned the morality of what was unfolding, though their voices were often drowned out by the clink of gold and the roar of cannon fire. Portuguese influence grew steadily, woven into the fabric of West African life. They introduced new goods and technologies, altering local economies and power structures. But they also sowed seeds of division and exploitation that would echo through the centuries. The kingdoms that aligned with Portugal found themselves entangled in a system that enriched a few but devastated many. Those who resisted were left isolated, their strength eroded by relentless conflict. The Gold Coast became a paradox, a place of extraordinary wealth and unimaginable loss. For the Portuguese, it was a triumph of exploration, a testament to their daring and innovation. But for countless Africans, it was the beginning of a long and painful history, one that would stretch across oceans and generations. The sun continued to blaze over the coast, indifferent to the tales unfolding beneath its light. The waves carried away the ships, their sails now heavy with the weight of human lives. And the land watched, silent witness to the collision of worlds, its golden shores forever changed. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a deep, restless blue that seemed both inviting and threatening. On the deck of a Portuguese ship, a man stood, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sky and sea met in an endless embrace. Vasco da Gama was no stranger to the sea's moods, he had weathered its fury and revered its calm. Yet today, even his steady heart felt the weight of the unknown. This voyage was unlike any that had come before. The winds that filled their sails carried more than the scent of salt, they carried the hope and ambition of an entire nation. The fleet had set sail from Lisbon with a singular purpose, to find a direct sea route to India. It was not just about discovery, it was about power, wealth, and breaking the stranglehold of overland trade routes controlled by other empires. Europe's desire for spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, was insatiable. These humble ingredients, capable of transforming food and preserving it, were worth their weight in gold. The route to the Indies promised riches beyond imagination, but the journey to get there was perilous and uncharted. Months passed as the ships battled the whims of the Atlantic, the unrelenting heat of the equatorial sun, and the relentless bite of the wind. When they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, a sense of triumph swept through the crew. This once feared point had been conquered, the southern tip of Africa yielding to human determination. But the hardest part was still ahead. Sailing into the Indian Ocean, they were entering waters dominated by ancient maritime powers, where the waves carried the stories of Arab, Indian, and Chinese traders who had plied these routes for centuries. The coastlines they followed were unfamiliar, but the people they encountered were not strangers to trade. In places like Mozambique and Mombasa, bustling ports were alive with merchants from across the Indian Ocean. Portuguese ships, with their sleek designs and powerful cannons, were both a curiosity and a threat. Some welcomed them cautiously, intrigued by the goods they carried, others viewed them with suspicion, their motives all too clear. When Vasco da Gama's fleet finally reached Calicut, on the southwestern coast of India, the air was thick with the aroma of spices. The bustling city was a kaleidoscope of sights, sounds, and smells, a place where cultures collided and wealth flowed like water. The rulers of Calicut were wary of these pale-skinned strangers, their intentions veiled behind polite words and grand gestures. The Portuguese came bearing gifts, but these offerings, humble by Indian standards, betrayed their ignorance. The locals accepted them with polite amusement, their smiles masking their skepticism. Da Gama, however, was not a man easily discouraged. He negotiated with determination, keen to establish a foothold in this lucrative trade. The path was fraught with obstacles, language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and the ever-present threat of hostility. Local merchants, especially the well-established Arab traders, were quick to see the Portuguese as competitors, intruders in a system that had functioned for centuries without them. These tensions simmered beneath the surface, ready to boil over at any moment. The return voyage to Portugal was harrowing. Disease ravaged the crew, leaving the ships eerily quiet as men succumbed to scurvy and exhaustion. The ocean, once a partner in their quest, seemed to turn against them, throwing storms and relentless winds in their path. By the time they limped back into Lisbon, only a fraction of those who had set out remained. Yet they carried with them something more valuable than gold, proof that a sea route to India was possible. The spices they brought back were a tantalizing taste of what lay ahead. The significance of Vasco da Gama's voyage was not lost on Portugal's leaders. It marked the beginning of a new era, one where the Indian Ocean would no longer belong solely to the traders of Asia and the Middle East. Portuguese ships returned, stronger and more determined, staking their claim on the spice trade. They established trading posts and fortresses along the coasts of India and beyond, each one a symbol of their growing dominance. But the path to power was neither smooth nor without bloodshed. The Portuguese faced fierce resistance from local rulers and rival traders, their presence an unwelcome disruption to the established order. They relied on their superior naval technology and the devastating power of their cannons to enforce their will. Battles were fought on the open sea and in coastal towns, the waters of the Indian Ocean stained with the cost of ambition. The challenges were immense. Navigating these waters required skill and courage, as the monsoon winds dictated the rhythms of trade and travel. The Portuguese had to learn quickly, adapting to the cycles of the ocean and the complexities of the cultures they encountered. In many cases, they resorted to brute force when diplomacy failed, their cannons speaking louder than their words. Through it all, Vasco da Gama's name became synonymous with daring and determination. His voyage had opened a door to the east, a door that Portugal was determined to keep open. The spice trade, once controlled by ancient powers, now flowed through Portuguese hands, enriching the nation and changing the course of history. But the cost of this dominance was high. The Indian Ocean, once a place of shared trade and mutual benefit, became a battleground for control and exploitation. For the people who had called these waters home for generations, the arrival of the Portuguese was both a blessing and a curse, bringing new opportunities but also disruption and loss. The winds that had carried Vasco da Gama to India continued to blow, restless and unchanging. The ocean, vast and eternal, watched as ships came and went, its waves indifferent to the human stories unfolding upon its surface. But for those who had ventured into its depths, the Indian Ocean was no longer just a body of water, it was a stage for ambition, a proving ground for courage, and a reminder of both the heights humanity could reach and the shadows it could cast. The streets of Goa were alive with the scent of spices, the murmur of prayers, and the clash of cultures. Once a thriving port under local rule, it now stood as a testament to a changing world. The Portuguese banners fluttered in the humid air, their bold colors a stark contrast to the deep greens of the surrounding palm trees. The conquest of Goa was more than just a military victory, it was the beginning of a dream, an ambitious vision of power and faith that would ripple across the Indian subcontinent. The assault on Goa was swift and decisive. Portuguese ships, armed with formidable cannons, approached the shores with an air of inevitability. Afonso de Albuquerque, the fearless commander leading the charge, saw Goa not just as a prize, but as a keystone. Its strategic location on the western coast of India made it the perfect hub for trade, influence, and control. The defenders, though valiant, were no match for the Portuguese firepower and determination. In 1510, the city fell, and the Portuguese flag was raised over its walls. But the conquest was only the beginning. The Portuguese faced the daunting task of transforming a foreign land into a cornerstone of their empire. They worked quickly to establish their rule, building forts and administrative centers that would cement their hold on the region. Yet Goa was not an empty canvas. Its people had their own traditions, beliefs, and ways of life. To rule, the Portuguese had to navigate the complexities of a culture they barely understood. Religion became both a bridge and a battlefield. The Portuguese crown, driven by a fierce sense of missionary zeal, saw Goa as a land ripe for conversion. Priests and missionaries arrived in waves, carrying crosses and the teachings of a faith they believed to be universal. Churches rose alongside mosques and temples, their grand spires reaching for the heavens. The Basilica of Bom Jesus, its ornate facade gleaming in the sun, became a beacon for Christianity in the East. Goa soon earned the title Rome of the East, its streets filled with the echoes of hymns and the whispers of prayers. Conversion, however, was not a simple act of faith. For some, it was a choice made out of conviction, the teachings of Christianity resonating in their hearts. For others, it was a matter of survival or opportunity. The Portuguese offered protection, favor, and access to resources for those who embraced their religion, creating a tangled web of faith and politics. Yet resistance lingered. Many clung fiercely to their own beliefs, finding solace and strength in traditions passed down through generations. The rulers of nearby Indian states watched these changes with wary eyes. The Portuguese were not just traders or visitors, they were conquerors, eager to impose their will. Relations with local kingdoms were a mixture of diplomacy, alliances, and conflict. Treaties were signed with one hand, while the other held the hilt of a sword. The Portuguese navigated these dynamics with a combination of cunning and force, knowing that their survival depended on understanding the intricate power structures of the land. Goa itself became a place of contradictions. The bustling markets hummed with life as traders from across Asia and Europe exchanged goods and ideas. Spices, silks, and gold changed hands alongside stories of far-off lands. Yet beneath the vibrant commerce lay tensions that could not be ignored. The Portuguese presence brought opportunities, but it also disrupted centuries-old ways of life. Farmers, artisans, and merchants found themselves navigating a world that was both familiar and foreign. In the midst of all this, the spirit of Goa endured. Its people, resilient and resourceful, adapted to the changes around them. The Portuguese administrators, for all their efforts to impose their authority, could not fully erase the soul of the land. Goa's streets became a living tapestry, where European architecture stood side by side with Indian artistry, and where the chants of Catholic prayers mingled with the melodies of local songs. The dreams of the Portuguese crown found their fullest expression in Goa. It was a place where ambition met faith, where trade routes intersected with the tides of empire. But it was also a place of humanity, of people striving to make sense of a world that seemed to shift beneath their feet. The waves that lapped against Goa's shores carried with them stories of change, resilience, and the unyielding spirit of a land that refused to be defined by conquest alone. The air over Malacca was thick with the scent of clove and nutmeg, the lifeblood of a trade that stretched across the known world. The city, nestled along the narrow strait that bore its name, was a glittering jewel of commerce, where merchants from China, Arabia, India, and beyond converged. Its markets hummed with activity, a symphony of languages and cultures woven together by the rhythm of trade. But beneath the bustling surface lay a fragile balance of power, one that was about to be shattered by the arrival of a new force. Portuguese ships, their sails billowing against the backdrop of a crimson sky, arrived at Malacca's shores in 1511. The conquest was led by Afonso de Albuquerque, a commander whose vision for Portugal's empire burned brighter than the sun on the water. Malacca was more than a city, it was the key to controlling the trade routes of Southeast Asia. The strait it guarded was a lifeline for ships laden with spices, silk, and precious goods bound for Europe and beyond. The city resisted fiercely. Its defenders, drawn from diverse communities that had thrived together for generations, fought with a courage born of desperation. But they were no match for the Portuguese cannons, whose thunder echoed across the harbor. When the dust settled, Malacca was theirs, its wealth flowing into Portuguese hands. Yet, the conquest was only the beginning of a struggle far greater than Albuquerque could have imagined. Beyond Malacca lay a chain of islands that seemed almost mythical in their abundance. The Spice Islands, known today as the Moluccas, were the source of the world's most coveted treasures, clove, nutmeg, and mace. These tiny fragments of land held an almost magical allure, their spices so rare and valuable that they were worth more than gold. But the islands were no unclaimed paradise. They were home to proud and independent peoples, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of the sea and the seasons. The Portuguese arrived with grand ambitions, but they quickly discovered they were not alone. The local sultans, whose rule stretched across the islands, were seasoned leaders, adept at navigating the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined their world. Arab, Indian, and Chinese merchants had long established networks here, their influence deeply rooted. The Portuguese, with their weapons and foreign ways, were interlopers in a land that had thrived without them. As they pressed deeper into the islands, the Portuguese encountered resistance that was both fierce and elusive. Warriors emerged from the dense jungles, their attacks swift and deadly before vanishing back into the shadows. In the harbors, rival ships loomed on the horizon, Dutch and English vessels, their captains driven by the same hunger for dominance. The struggle for control of the Spice Islands was no longer just a contest with local powers, it had become a battle between empires. The waters of Southeast Asia were alive with tension, the tides carrying whispers of conflict and ambition. Portuguese ships patrolled the straits, their crews ever watchful for the flash of enemy sails. Each port they took was a victory, but it came at a cost. Fortresses rose along the coasts, their walls bristling with cannons, but they could never truly secure the sprawling, fragmented world of the islands. Trade continued, but always under the shadow of violence. In Timor, the Portuguese sought another foothold, drawn by tales of sandalwood forests that stretched endlessly into the horizon. The island, remote and rugged, offered both promise and peril. Its people, fiercely independent, viewed the newcomers with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. The Portuguese brought gifts and promises, but also demands. They built missions and trading posts, their presence growing like vines through the land. Yet, the rugged terrain and the resilience of Timor's people made their control tenuous at best. Amid the clash of empires and the roar of cannons, there were moments of unexpected humanity. Portuguese traders and settlers found themselves adapting to the cultures they encountered, their lives shaped by the rhythms of the land. In the markets, bargains were struck with smiles and nods, the universal language of trade bridging gaps that words could not. Missionaries, with their simple robes and earnest prayers, sat with local leaders under the shade of palm trees, sharing meals and stories. These fleeting moments of connection softened the harshness of conquest, a reminder that even in conflict, there was room for understanding. The cultural and economic systems of Southeast Asia were unlike anything the Portuguese had known. Here, trade was not just a transaction, it was a way of life, deeply tied to the seasons, the sea, and the spirit of the people. Spices were not mere commodities, they were sacred, used in rituals and medicine, their value extending far beyond the coins they commanded. The Portuguese, for all their might, could not fully grasp the intricate balance that sustained this world. The Spice Islands, with their vibrant forests and turquoise waters, bore witness to the price of ambition. The local kingdoms fought to preserve their way of life, their resilience as enduring as the spices that grew in their soil. The Dutch and English pressed forward, their ships bristling with power, eager to wrest control from the Portuguese. And the Portuguese, their vision of empire, both their strength and their burden, struggled to hold their ground. Through it all, the spirit of Southeast Asia endured. The islands, with their breathtaking beauty and rich traditions, refused to be defined by the battles fought upon their shores. The spices continued to grow, their scent carried on the wind, a reminder of the land's resilience and the enduring connection between its people and the earth. And the seas, restless and eternal, bore silent witness to the ebb and flow of empires, their waves carrying the stories of those who dared to dream and those who refused to yield. The harbor of Macau shimmered under the soft light of dawn, its waters a mirror reflecting the hopes and fears of those who arrived there. Portuguese ships, their hulls scarred by endless voyages, swayed gently against the currents. To the sailors who stepped ashore, this was not just another port. It was a threshold to one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever known. Behind the walls of the city lay China, a land vast and ancient, whose people spoke in tones as fluid as the brushstrokes of their calligraphy. In 1557, the Portuguese gained a foothold in this new world. Macau, perched at the edge of the Chinese Empire, became a place where cultures collided and converged. The agreement that allowed them to stay was delicate, built on careful diplomacy and strict boundaries. The Chinese, proud and powerful, viewed the Portuguese with a mix of curiosity and caution. The traders were granted permission to live and work, but they remained outsiders, always under watchful eyes. The city blossomed into a crossroads, its streets alive with the hum of commerce and the mingling of worlds. Chinese merchants brought silk and porcelain, their wares exquisite and unmatched. Portuguese traders, weathered from years at sea, offered silver, spices, and goods from lands far beyond the horizon. Markets overflowed with colors, sounds, and scents, a vibrant mosaic that reflected the meeting of two very different ways of life. But Macau was more than a trading post. It became a sanctuary for faith. Jesuit missionaries, clad in simple robes, arrived with dreams of bringing Christianity to China's vast population. They carried crosses and books, their words woven with a sincerity that captured the hearts of many. Among them was Matteo Ricci, an Italian priest whose deep respect for Chinese culture set him apart. He learned their language, studied their traditions, and presented himself not as a conqueror but as a humble student. His efforts opened doors, but they were narrow and fleeting. The Chinese embraced him as a scholar, but the religion he represented remained foreign and distant. Farther to the east, Portuguese ships sailed toward another enigmatic land, Japan. In 1543, they arrived by chance, their vessel tossed ashore by a storm. What they found was a land of samurai and shoguns, its people bound by a code of honor as sharp and unyielding as their swords. The Portuguese brought gifts that dazzled the Japanese, muskets, goods from distant lands, and, most of all, a new faith. The arrival of Christianity in Japan was a moment of transformation. Missionaries like Francis Xavier walked the roads of Kyushu, their voices carrying the message of love and salvation. The Japanese, ever curious and pragmatic, listened. Some embraced the teachings with open hearts, finding in Christianity a sense of hope and connection. Villages became centers of devotion, their churches rising like whispers of Europe in a land so far removed. For a time, it seemed as if the faith would flourish, its roots digging deep into Japanese soil. Yet the path was never smooth. The Japanese rulers, wary of foreign influence, began to question the motives behind the Portuguese presence. What had started as an exchange of goods and ideas became a source of tension. The guns the Portuguese had introduced changed the balance of power in Japan, while their faith sowed seeds of division. By the late 16th century, suspicion turned to action. The Tokugawa shogunate, determined to preserve Japan's sovereignty, expelled the missionaries and outlawed Christianity. Those who had converted were forced to choose between their faith and their lives. The once promising relationship between Portugal and Japan withered, leaving behind stories of sacrifice and courage that still echo through history. Even in China, the Portuguese influence began to fade. The empire was vast and self-sufficient, its rulers wary of any outside force that might disrupt their carefully balanced world. The Qing dynasty, which rose to power in the mid-17th century, tightened control over foreign trade. The Portuguese, once vital intermediaries, found themselves increasingly sidelined. The flow of goods and ideas slowed, and the bustling energy of Macau began to dim. Macau, Japan, and China, three lands, each unique, each touched by the Portuguese in ways profound and fleeting. The Portuguese came as traders, missionaries, and dreamers, their hearts filled with the fire of ambition and faith. They faced resistance and embraced fleeting alliances, their influence growing and waning like the tides. And though their time at the edge of these empires was brief in the grand sweep of history, the echoes of their presence linger still, carried on the winds that sweep across the seas they once ruled. The waves of the Atlantic seemed endless, a blue expanse stretching to the horizon as the ships of Pedro Álvares Cabral sailed westward. The air was heavy with the salt of the ocean, the creaking timbers of the caravels blending with the sound of the wind. The sailors, weary from months at sea, gazed ahead, searching for something, anything, beyond the monotony of water and sky. When the cry finally came from the crow's nest, the word that sent a ripple of energy through the weary crew, land, it was not the coast of India they had hoped for, but something entirely unexpected. On April 22, 1500, Cabral and his men set foot on the shores of a land unlike any they had ever known. The coastline stretched endlessly, lush with dense forests that seemed to pulse with life. They named it Terra de Vera Cruz, the land of the true cross, though it would later become known as Brazil. The discovery was unplanned, a twist of fate brought on by shifting winds and ocean currents. But what they found there would change the course of Portuguese history forever. The indigenous people who greeted them were as curious as the sailors themselves. These were the Tupiniquim, the first of many tribes the Portuguese would encounter. They lived in harmony with the land, their lives shaped by its rhythms and resources. They approached the strangers with caution, their dark eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The Portuguese offered trinkets, shiny beads, mirrors, and metal tools, exchanging them for food, feathers, and the brilliant red dye extracted from the pau-brasil tree, a wood so valuable it would give the new land its name. But this encounter, so seemingly innocent, marked the beginning of a story filled with struggle and sorrow. The Portuguese saw Brazil not as a home but as a resource, a place to be exploited for its riches. The forests were vast, the soil fertile, and the potential for profit immense. When settlers began arriving in greater numbers, they brought with them the seeds of an industry that would transform the land forever: sugar. Sugarcane plantations sprang up along the coast, their green stalks swaying in the warm breeze. The work of cultivation was brutal, demanding backbreaking labor under the blazing sun. At first, the Portuguese tried to use the indigenous people as laborers. But the Tupiniquim, the Tupi, and other tribes resisted fiercely. They fought to protect their lands, their families, and their way of life. Skirmishes erupted along the edges of the settlements, arrows meeting musket fire in battles that were as much about survival as they were about territory. The Portuguese responded with increasing cruelty, their weapons and tactics designed to break the spirit of the resistance. Villages were burned, and captives were taken to work in the plantations. But the indigenous people, resilient and defiant, often escaped into the forests they knew so intimately. The land, vast and untamed, became both a prison and a sanctuary, offering refuge to those who refused to submit. Faced with the challenges of indigenous resistance and the grueling demands of sugar production, the Portuguese turned their gaze across the ocean. From Africa came ships laden with human lives, captives torn from their homelands and forced into a life of unimaginable hardship. The transatlantic slave trade became the lifeblood of Brazil's sugar economy. Men, women, and children were sold like goods, their humanity stripped away as they were chained and herded into the brutal confines of plantation life. The enslaved Africans brought with them more than their labor. They carried their culture, their traditions, and their unyielding spirit. Their songs, filled with sorrow and longing, echoed through the fields as they worked. They built hidden communities in the forests, quilombos, where they could live free, if only for a while. Leaders like Zumbi of Palmares emerged as symbols of resistance, their names whispered with reverence and hope. In the towns and along the plantations, the blending of cultures created something new. Portuguese, African, and indigenous influences mixed to shape the identity of the land. This was a fusion born not of choice but of survival, a patchwork of resilience woven through centuries of hardship. Yet even as Brazil's wealth grew, the cost was immeasurable. The forests, once teeming with life, were slowly consumed by the insatiable demand for sugar. The indigenous population, decimated by disease and violence, dwindled, their voices fading like whispers on the wind. And the enslaved, whose sweat and blood built the plantations, carried the weight of a sorrow that could never be fully expressed. The land itself seemed to mourn, its rivers and hills bearing silent witness to the suffering and resilience of those who lived upon it. Each sunrise brought new struggles, but also the unyielding spirit of those who refused to be broken. Brazil, vast and untamed, became a land of contrasts, a place of beauty and pain, of hope and loss, its story etched into the very soil beneath its people's feet. The sun burned fiercely above the shores of West Africa, its light glinting off the waves as they broke against the sand. The air was thick with salt and something else, something heavy and unspoken. Along the coast, ships lay anchored, their wooden hulls towering over the bustling forts and trading posts that lined the shore. Men in chains were led from the inland paths, their faces marked with a mixture of fear, defiance, and resignation. The chains rattled softly, a chilling counterpoint to the distant hum of waves. This was the beginning of a journey that would change lives forever. Packed into the suffocating holds of Portuguese ships, the captives were no longer seen as individuals. They were cargo, measured and valued in cold calculations. These were people torn from their families, stripped of their identities, yet carrying within them the weight of cultures, histories, and dreams that no chains could suppress. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a nightmare. Cries of anguish and whispers of prayers filled the dark, airless spaces where they were confined. Disease and despair claimed many before they even reached the distant shores. For those who survived, the new land was not a promise of hope but a prison of endless labor. In Brazil, the heart of Portugal's empire, sugar plantations stretched as far as the eye could see. The enslaved worked from dawn until dusk, their hands blistered from cutting cane, their bodies bowed under the weight of oppression. The whip cracked mercilessly, a constant reminder of their captors' control. Yet, even in the darkest moments, there was resistance, a quiet defiance in stolen moments of song, in whispered stories of home, in the shared determination to endure. Slavery was not merely an economic engine, it became the lifeblood of the Portuguese Empire. The wealth of the sugar trade poured into Lisbon, transforming the city into a hub of splendor. Grand palaces rose, adorned with gold and treasures brought from the colonies. But this prosperity came at an unspeakable cost. Behind the glittering facades lay the silent cries of those whose labor had made it possible. The empire flourished, but its foundation was built on broken lives. The impact of slavery rippled far beyond the plantations. In cities like Salvador and Rio de Janeiro, the enslaved and free African communities shaped the culture of Brazil. Their music, dances, and rituals became inseparable from the fabric of the land, their resilience a testament to their spirit. Yet, they were constantly reminded of their place in a society that sought to erase their humanity. Laws and customs reinforced the boundaries, ensuring that the system of slavery remained firmly in place. Resistance simmered everywhere. On plantations, acts of sabotage, tools broken, fires set, were quiet rebellions against an unyielding system. Some fled, risking everything to escape into the dense forests, where quilombos, hidden communities of the free, offered a fragile sanctuary. Quilombo dos Palmares became a symbol of hope, its leader Zumbi a legend of resistance. These havens were more than places of refuge, they were testaments to the enduring strength of those who refused to accept bondage. In the empire's heartlands, the voices of abolition began as whispers and grew into a roar. Enlightenment ideas spread across Europe, challenging the morality of slavery. But for those who lived under its shadow, the fight was personal and immediate. Enslaved people themselves fought tirelessly, their resistance shaping the narrative of abolition as much as any politician or reformer. The end of slavery was not a single moment, but a series of hard-fought battles. Laws were debated and passed, yet enforcement was slow, and the scars of the trade ran deep. The abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1888 came long after the echoes of freedom had begun to sound elsewhere. When the Lei Áurea, or Golden Law, was signed, it marked the end of an era, but the legacy of slavery would remain etched into the soul of the nation. For centuries, the transatlantic slave trade had defined the Portuguese Empire. It brought wealth beyond imagination and suffering beyond measure. And yet, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the human spirit endured. Songs of sorrow became songs of survival. Cultures fractured by distance were rebuilt in foreign lands. The enslaved, though bound by chains, carried within them an unbreakable core, a strength that could never be silenced. Their story is one of pain, but also of resilience, a testament to the enduring light of humanity even in the darkest of times. The crack of the whip echoed through the dense, unbroken forest. The sound was sharp, harsh, and filled with a promise of violence. In the distance, the flicker of fires burned in the night, illuminating the faces of the bandeirantes, men driven by nothing but the hunt for riches and the lust for power. These were not the soldiers of the king, but explorers and adventurers, ruthless in their pursuit of gold and the treasures hidden deep in Brazil's vast interior. They had no maps to follow, only whispers of rumors and half-remembered stories from those who had once crossed the uncharted wilderness. The bandeirantes were men who had given up their old lives, husbands, fathers, sons, becoming something different in the wilds of Brazil. For them, the forests were not places of beauty, but untamed obstacles, full of danger, that they could conquer. Their hearts beat with ambition as they carved paths where no man had tread before, hacking through the jungles with machetes and setting their sights on the land beyond the reach of the crown. In the heat of their pursuit, they ignored the silent cries of the land they took from. Indigenous tribes who had lived in the shadows of the towering trees for centuries now found their homes invaded by these relentless men. The Bandeirantes were more than explorers, they were conquerors. Their eyes weren't just on the land, they were on the riches they believed were buried in its heart. Every mound of earth could hide gold, every river could lead to treasure. And in their wake, the indigenous populations, who had once roamed freely, were scattered and enslaved. They were drawn to the interior like moths to a flame. Stories of gold spread like wildfire, stoking the imaginations of every man who had ever dreamt of striking it rich. With each day spent in the wild, each day pushing further into the unknown, the promise of wealth became more real. The Bandeirantes established settlements, tiny outposts, by carving roads through the heart of the land. They were there to plunder, but they stayed to build, staking their claim on the fertile soil they found. The gold they sought was buried beneath rivers and stones, waiting to be pulled from the earth. They came for it with hands that could no longer tell the difference between gold dust and the soil beneath their nails. They found it, yes, in pieces scattered through the jungle and the dense hills of Minas Gerais. The discovery sent waves of greed across the land, igniting further waves of violence. The search for riches didn't just break the land, it broke the people who had lived there for millennia. But while the Bandeirantes reveled in their new wealth, the indigenous peoples, whose ancestors had lived harmoniously with the forests, were torn apart. Their villages were razed. Their men and women, once warriors and farmers, were enslaved, forced to dig, to work, and to give up everything they had ever known. The search for gold wasn't just about the riches, it was about the destruction of an entire world. Indigenous tribes like the Tupi, the Guarani, and the Kaingang had thrived on the land for centuries, but the arrival of the Bandeirantes turned their world upside down. With each violent raid and forced march, their traditions and cultures began to disintegrate. Families were torn apart, elders were killed, and the land they had once shared with the earth became a battleground for something far more ruthless: colonization. The Bandeirantes didn't just seek gold, they sought dominion over the soul of the land itself. In the wake of the Bandeirantes' conquest, new settlements were established, new roads cut through the forests, and entire landscapes were forever altered. Towns began to grow around the newfound wealth, cities rose from the ashes of what once was wilderness. Brazil, already a land of extremes, of lush forests and endless rivers, of vast plains and jagged mountains, was reshaped by the greed of those who saw it as little more than a treasure chest to be plundered. But the land fought back. As settlers moved deeper into the forests, they encountered something they hadn't counted on: the deep, unyielding wool of the land itself. The further they moved, the more resistant it became. Disease spread quickly, wiping out entire settlements. The dense jungles hid dangers that no European could predict. For every ounce of gold, there was a cost, whether in blood or in sweat. Yet, the Bandeirantes pressed on. Their success in finding gold only fueled their desire to go further. The land they once called wild became a place of possibility. And while they reveled in their conquests, there were moments when the thought of those they had displaced crept into their minds. The destruction of cultures was something that could not be seen clearly through the fog of greed. With every city that arose, another village was lost. Each stream that shimmered with gold was another river where the lives of indigenous people were irrevocably altered. For those who remained, the forest was no longer just a place to hunt or gather. It had become a place of sorrow. The earth, which once nourished, now seemed to punish. The woods whispered their grief in the rustling of leaves, and the rivers, once clear and abundant, ran red with the stain of conflict. The Bandeirantes had left their mark on this place, but so had the indigenous peoples. Their stories, their lives, their cultures were written into the land itself, even as they fought to survive in a world they could no longer recognize. What the Bandeirantes had achieved was clear to them: they had found wealth, and in doing so, they had claimed the land. What they left behind was something much harder to see. The gold they sought glittered with the blood of the indigenous, and their so-called victory was built on a broken foundation. The past, a shadow that loomed over every stone and every settlement, would forever remind the land of what had been lost. The sound of the royal bell echoed through the narrow streets of Lisbon, its deep clang resonating across the city as the king's commands were passed from one hand to another. Somewhere, far across the seas, in the colonies that stretched from Brazil to Africa and Asia, the same bell seemed to vibrate through the air, though its sound would never reach those who worked in the fields, the traders in the bustling ports, or the men who sailed the treacherous waters. Yet, the bell's authority was absolute, its toll marking the power of the monarchy that ruled over an empire so vast, so distant, that many in Portugal could hardly conceive of its true scope. In the heart of the empire, King João, Manuel, or their successors sat at their thrones, distant figures whose decrees carried the weight of the world's oceans and mountains. But what happened when those commands, issued in the regal silence of a palace, reached the ears of men and women who would never see the king's face? Those who governed, ruled, and shaped lives across an ocean could only carry with them the fragile connection to their sovereign, a thin thread of bureaucracy that tied them back to Lisbon, but seemed to fray as quickly as it was spun. In the colonies, the governors stood in place of the king, men sent to wield power in the name of Portugal, to impose the royal rule on lands as far as the eye could see. They carried with them an unspoken mandate, to extract wealth, to maintain order, and to ensure that the glory of the Portuguese crown spread through the colonies like the roots of a tree, deep into the soil of foreign lands. But these men were not kings, and they were not gods. They were flesh and blood, often struggling to enforce the king's decrees over a vast and often hostile land. Communication, slow as the ships that brought messages across the water, meant that decisions taken in Lisbon could take months, even years, to reach the farthest corners of the empire. On the ground in Brazil, Angola, or Goa, these governors were often left to their own devices. No matter how powerful their position, they were at the mercy of the land they controlled, the challenges that arose, and the people who lived there. They were also bound by the distant bureaucracy of Lisbon, a web of officials and laws, papers and signatures that seemed to grow more tangled with each passing year. The king's will, written in flowing script, was sometimes incomprehensible to the men who had to enforce it across oceans of distance, with no reliable means of communication except the creaking of wooden ships. The daily life of these governors was far from the glory of court life. It was filled with the constant hum of paperwork, the writing and signing of documents, and the demands of a colonial system that was growing increasingly complex. They faced threats from indigenous tribes, the pressure to manage and expand sugar plantations, and the ongoing tension between Portuguese settlers and the enslaved population. But in all of this, the underlying force that shaped everything was the need to ensure that the taxes, the gold, and the precious resources kept flowing to Lisbon. The empire's heartbeat was measured in the flow of wealth, and every part of the machinery depended on it. Yet, despite all this effort, there was a fundamental disconnect. The king, sitting in his palace in Lisbon, could never truly understand what life was like in the furthest reaches of his empire. His decrees, signed with a flourish, were often met with confusion and frustration in the colonies. What worked in one place did not work in another. The customs, the geography, and the needs of the people were all so different that governance, as idealized by the monarchy, often seemed like an impossible dream. The taxes demanded from the colonies, while essential for maintaining the crown's power, often pushed the colonies to the brink of revolt. With each new law, each new order sent from Lisbon, resentment grew in the hearts of the people who were forced to comply. The distances themselves were a constant challenge. The slow and dangerous sea voyages meant that communication from Lisbon to Brazil or India was unreliable and infrequent. By the time a new order arrived, it was often too late to address the problems that had already emerged. Decisions made in the heart of the empire, decisions about trade, resources, or even military strategy, were often irrelevant to the everyday struggles of those on the ground in the colonies. The governors, though in charge, were often unable to act swiftly enough to contain uprisings or prevent economic collapse. The people of the colonies, whether they were Portuguese settlers, enslaved Africans, or indigenous peoples, were governed by an invisible hand that seemed both distant and omnipotent. While the monarchs and their governors issued laws and levied taxes, they were also helpless against the unpredictable forces of nature, the shifting alliances of indigenous tribes, and the constant push of foreign rivals. The challenge of controlling such a vast empire was not just about managing people and wealth, it was about managing uncertainty, about responding to crises that no decree could foresee. And so, despite all their efforts, the empire strained under its own weight. For those in Lisbon, the empire's glittering wealth, its riches from Brazil, from the Spice Islands, from gold mines in Africa, seemed like a promise fulfilled. But for those in the colonies, the reality was different. They faced exhaustion, fear, and frustration. They worked under the shadow of an empire that demanded everything from them, while offering little in return except the faint hope that, somewhere far away, the king might care enough to send a new decree that would make their lives easier. But that hope was often dashed by the relentless demands of bureaucracy, by the endless paperwork that came from Lisbon and was passed from one official to another, each carrying with it a little more distance from the reality on the ground. The empire that stretched across oceans was built on the shoulders of those who could not see the king's face, who only knew the empire's demands. It was a system that seemed eternal, but one that was constantly threatened by the tension between the distant, glittering power of Lisbon and the harsh, messy realities of the colonies. And as the empire grew, so too did the cracks that appeared in its structure, the cracks that would one day lead to its unraveling. The burning sun beat down on the dusty ground, where the thick scent of incense filled the air, mixing with the sounds of unfamiliar languages. The tall spires of the church, newly built from stone, stood in sharp contrast to the fragile huts that dotted the landscape. It was a quiet, uneasy moment. The indigenous people, their eyes wide with curiosity and fear, gathered around, unsure of what was unfolding before them. But from the distance, a procession of white-robed figures made their way toward the community. These were not just men of faith, they were messengers of an empire that stretched across oceans, carrying with them a power that reached beyond kingdoms. These were the Jesuits. The first whispers of what they called the spiritual conquest had already begun to reverberate across the land. It wasn't just about the gold, the spices, or the riches that drew the Portuguese to foreign shores. No, there was something more sacred, more profound driving them forward, the idea that the Catholic faith would be spread across the world, bringing with it the divine approval of the empire's expansion. The crown's banners may have flown high above the colonies, but it was the cross that carried the weight of divine justification. What seemed like an outward quest for wealth and territory had a deep, spiritual undercurrent, one that could neither be ignored nor denied. The Jesuits, among other religious orders, took this sacred mission to heart. They weren't just priests, they were soldiers in a different kind of war, one fought not with swords, but with the strength of faith. Their presence in the colonies was as much about salvation as it was about subjugation. The indigenous people, some of whom had never before seen a European, now faced an onslaught of prayers, baptisms, and sermons. To the Portuguese, they were souls to be saved, a blank canvas on which the light of Catholicism would be painted. But the mission was far from easy. For the Jesuits, the task of converting these people was not just a matter of doctrine, it was about navigating a complex, often hostile landscape. The first encounter with these foreign lands was unsettling. The language barriers, the deep-rooted cultures, and the intense resistance from local communities all added to the challenge. Yet, the Jesuits were relentless. They built schools, churches, and missions, working to establish their spiritual empire. With each prayer, each baptism, they planted a seed, though not all of them would take root. In the heart of Brazil, the Jesuits established the now famous Jesuit reductions, villages where indigenous people were gathered and protected. These settlements, often surrounded by tall, protective walls, were intended to shield the indigenous people from the dangers of colonization, ensuring that they could be converted without falling into the hands of Portuguese settlers, whose greed and brutality were notorious. The Jesuits taught them about Catholicism, but also about European agriculture, trade, and law. In return, the indigenous people provided labor, which, in many ways, mirrored the forced labor systems of the colonial authorities. But this attempt to shield them from the cruelty of colonialism wasn't always successful. The Jesuits had their own struggles, particularly as they tried to balance their religious duties with the political and economic realities of the empire. The indigenous people, caught between the demands of both the Portuguese crown and the missionaries, often found themselves in a dangerous limbo. Their traditional ways of life were slowly eroded as the Jesuits imposed new rules and customs. In many ways, the missionaries were seen as protectors, but to others, they were agents of an empire that was slowly unraveling their very existence. As tensions built between the Portuguese settlers and the Jesuits, the cracks in their uneasy alliance began to show. The settlers, driven by the promise of wealth from sugar plantations, gold, and trade, grew frustrated with the Jesuits' efforts to protect the indigenous populations. They didn't see the missions as places of spiritual refuge, they saw them as barriers to their own financial ambitions. The Jesuits' insistence on protecting the indigenous people from exploitation meant that they were often at odds with the very men who were meant to support the crown's rule. This tension eventually led to a brutal confrontation. In the 1750s, the Portuguese government, determined to extend its control over the colonies, expelled the Jesuits. Their lands were seized, their missions dismantled, and their influence severely reduced. The Jesuits, who had once been the spiritual backbone of the Portuguese Empire in the New World, found themselves stripped of their power, their legacy nearly erased from the continent they had helped to shape. For the indigenous populations, this expulsion was devastating. The protection they had once known was gone, and they were once again vulnerable to the violence and exploitation of the settlers. In these conflicts, the line between spirituality and imperialism blurred beyond recognition. To the settlers, the Jesuits' mission was not just about converting souls, it was a challenge to their own power and their claim over the land. To the Jesuits, their mission was a holy one, a calling from God that would carry them through whatever challenges they faced. And to the indigenous populations, caught in the middle of this war of faith, they were left with a cruel irony. What began as a chance for salvation often ended as a loss of their freedom, their identity, and their land. It wasn't just the Jesuits who found themselves at odds with colonial authorities. Other religious orders, such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, too, found their missions in conflict with the empire's interests. But it was the Jesuits who stood at the forefront of this battle, their ideals and actions often seen as both a blessing and a curse. They fought for the souls of the indigenous people, but they also fought for their dignity, their way of life. And in doing so, they made enemies not just among the settlers, but among the very empire that sent them. As the centuries passed and the empire began to crumble, the legacy of the Jesuits remained a haunting presence. Their influence, both positive and negative, continued to reverberate through the colonies. In the end, their mission to conquer hearts and minds left behind a complex legacy, a legacy of faith, conflict, and a deeply entangled struggle between spiritual salvation and imperial domination. The bustling streets of Lisbon were alive with energy as merchants hurried to and fro, their carts laden with riches from faraway lands. Above, the sea was a glimmering expanse, filled with the promise of distant shores and treasures untold. But it wasn't just the merchants who controlled this vast network. Behind the scenes, far away in the imposing halls of the Casa de India, a silent power worked, shaping the empire's fortunes, deciding what would flow through its ports and how the empire would thrive or wither. Inside those walls, decisions were made that would shape the fates of entire continents. This was not just a trade office, it was the beating heart of Portugal's economic empire. Here, powerful men with sharp minds and deep pockets laid the foundation for the wealth that would pour into Lisbon, turning the city into the thriving jewel of Europe. But this wealth came at a cost, one that would echo through generations. The Casa de India controlled nearly every aspect of Portugal's overseas trade. It wasn't just about exchanging goods, it was about creating monopolies, binding entire regions to Portugal's will. From the spice-filled coasts of India to the gold-rich lands of Brazil, this institution oversaw the trade of valuable commodities that would keep the empire strong, from sugar and ivory to the most coveted of all, spices. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, luxuries that once seemed out of reach were now brought to the tables of Europe, transforming not just diets, but the way people thought about their world. The promise of these rare spices set the sails of many ships, sent brave sailors to face unknown dangers, and left behind treasures that were both precious and brutal in their creation. Yet, as much as the Casa de India was a symbol of success, its monopoly brought with it dark consequences. Every piece of gold mined, every sack of spices brought home, came at the expense of lives, enslaved, exploited, and often lost to the waves of time. The ships that sailed from Lisbon were not just filled with goods, they carried the souls of men, women, and children, shackled and bound, destined for the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. The trade in slaves was as vital to the empire's economy as the gold and spices that flowed through its ports. The Casa de India, as much as it focused on controlling valuable goods, knew that a thriving empire needed more than just wealth, it needed labor. The African continent, rich with people and resources, became the source of this labor. Millions of men and women were taken from their homes, shipped across oceans, and forced into grueling labor on sugar plantations, in mines, and on the docks. Their labor built the empire, but at what cost? The pain of their journey, the cries that filled the ships as they crossed the Atlantic, are hard to even imagine today. Yet, the empire thrived on their suffering. And so, the question arose, how could such a beautiful, sprawling empire, one that made Portugal the envy of the world, be built upon such suffering? The answer lay in the pursuit of power. To dominate the seas, to control the vast wealth of the world, the Portuguese monarchy and its traders needed the labor to keep it all going. At the same time, the trade in gold flourished, making Portugal one of the wealthiest empires in Europe for a time. The glittering yellow metal, so rich in value, flowed in abundance from the lands of Brazil. The king and his officials celebrated the wealth, as rivers of gold seemed to pour into the royal treasury. Cities like Lisbon and Porto grew, their streets paved with fortune, their markets overflowing with goods from every corner of the globe. The empire's power felt unstoppable. Yet, even as the riches poured in, cracks began to appear in the empire's armor. It was easy to see the shimmering surface, but beneath, the reality was far more fragile. Monopolies, while lucrative, stifled competition. The Casa de India, in its grip on trade, also stifled innovation. Goods from Portugal's colonies, whether in Africa, Brazil, or India, flowed to Lisbon, but there was little incentive for the colonies to develop their own industries, to grow beyond the single trade items that fueled the empire. Over time, this reliance on monopolies began to backfire. The empire became bloated and rigid, unable to adapt to the changing currents of the world. The failure to see the coming storm was felt not only in Lisbon but also in the colonies. The gold mines in Brazil began to run dry. The once vibrant plantations, with their sugar and tobacco, began to suffer from overexploitation. The men and women who had toiled in the fields grew tired. The brutal system of slavery, which had been the backbone of the empire's success, began to unravel under its own weight. In Lisbon, the great wealth from the colonies began to slow, and the once thriving port cities began to feel the chill of economic decline. Back in the heart of the empire, officials and traders scrambled to adjust, to find new ways to keep the flow of riches alive. But the damage had been done. For all the triumphs of the empire, the wealth, the trade, the control, it was the lives of countless enslaved people that had kept it alive. The buildings, the churches, the grand estates, they were all built on the backs of people who never had a choice, whose labor was extracted with brutality, and whose hopes were crushed beneath the weight of the empire's ambitions. The whispers of the cost of empire began to grow louder. Some dared to question the system that had brought such prosperity to Portugal. The merchants, who had grown fat on their profits, began to see the cracks in the foundation. Others, from the heart of Lisbon to the far reaches of Brazil, saw the cost in human terms. The question of whether the empire's success had been worth the price was one that no one could escape. But by the time the empire began to falter, the damage had been done. The empire, built on trade, was now crumbling, and the cost of its success was becoming painfully clear. The story of Portugal's empire is a story of extremes, of untold wealth and unimaginable suffering, of dreams built on the suffering of others, and of an economy that rose and fell like the tide. The Casa de India, with its grand offices and its iron grip on the empire's wealth, had once been the source of endless riches. But in the end, it became a reminder of the empire's fragility, how power, no matter how vast, is never without consequence. The air was thick with the smell of salt and smoke as the Portuguese ships, once the undisputed rulers of the seas, sailed into battle. The flags of the Dutch, the English, and the Spanish fluttered from ships that seemed to have appeared from the mist like vengeful phantoms. The once gilded empire of Portugal, spread across continents and oceans, now found itself under siege, not from a single foe, but from a trifecta of powers who were intent on taking a piece of its vast holdings. The shimmering promises of gold, spices, and glory were now contested on every front, and what once seemed inevitable, a continued reign of supremacy, was now teetering on the edge of collapse. For centuries, the Portuguese had held their dominion over the seas, their fleets cutting through the waters like the sharpest of knives. But as the empire's reach stretched further, so too did the ambitions of its rivals. The Dutch, with their cunning traders and powerful fleets, sought to claim what Portugal had built in Asia. The English, ever hungry for expansion, turned their eyes toward the riches of the New World and the Spice Islands of the East. And the Spanish, already entrenched in the Americas, grew more determined to challenge Portugal's dominance. It was not a matter of diplomacy or reason, it was a matter of survival. The Portuguese responded with their own fierce determination. Their soldiers, sailors, and traders fought with a tenacity born from years of proud empire building, but even they couldn't deny the growing power of their rivals. As the clash of ships echoed across the waves, the once feared Portuguese fleet began to show signs of wear. The sails that once caught the winds of destiny now seemed frayed, the hulls of their ships dented and scarred by the endless wars on the high seas. Victory, once certain, was slipping through their fingers. But the enemies were not just foreign. Across the lands they ruled, from the sugar plantations of Brazil to the distant shores of Africa, local rebellions began to stir. The indigenous populations, those who had once been subdued by the might of Portuguese guns, were rising up. With every victory of the Portuguese in their vast territories, there were others who whispered and plotted in the shadows, tired of the foreign rule that had imposed itself on their lands, their cultures, and their spirits. In Brazil, the native tribes, whose ancestors had walked the lands long before the first Portuguese ships had landed, began to rally against the empire's control. They fought with a desperation, knowing that their world was being taken from them piece by piece. Their resistance wasn't just about a fight for land, it was a fight for their dignity, their lives, their very identity. The Portuguese forces, so accustomed to conquering with force, found themselves battling more than just armies. They were battling for control of hearts and minds. The lands they had come to dominate fought back with every means at their disposal. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes in thick jungles, and fierce defense of sacred grounds led to a bloody war that tested the endurance of Portugal's army and the resolve of its empire. Even in Africa, where the Portuguese had built trade posts and fortified settlements, the story was the same. The African kingdoms, once allies, soon became foes. The fierce warriors of these lands, people who knew their environment like the backs of their hands, began to push back. The idea that Portugal's empire could expand unchecked came to an end when these powerful forces rose up to defend their cultures and their territories. The Portuguese could no longer walk into a village and claim it as their own. The winds of rebellion had swept across the land, and with them, a sense of urgency and fear. The resistance wasn't just against the invaders, it was against the very idea that one culture could subjugate another. The Portuguese Empire, for all its might, now had to face the consequences of its expansion. It was no longer enough to rely on its ships, its soldiers, or even its faith. The Portuguese found themselves, for the first time, confronted with a challenge they could not easily overcome. On the high seas, the struggle for supremacy grew more intense. The once mighty Portuguese navy, which had once commanded the world's oceans, was now hemmed in by Dutch, English, and Spanish ships. The great naval battles were no longer about Portugal asserting its dominance, they were about survival. The ships of the Dutch East India Company, sleek and deadly, cut through the waters with precision. English fleets, newly emboldened, began to encroach on Portuguese territories in the Americas. The Spanish, always a looming threat, pushed further into the Caribbean and beyond. The waters, once teeming with Portuguese sails, now became a battlefield, a place where the future of an empire hung in the balance. For Portugal, every defeat was a blow to its pride. Each ship lost was not just a loss of men and resources, it was a symbol of the weakening of the empire itself. The towering forts that had once stood as symbols of unchallenged power now felt vulnerable. The markets of Lisbon, which had been the busiest in Europe, began to quiet. The immense wealth that had once flowed from Brazil, India, and Africa now seemed threatened by every ship that arrived, bringing news of defeat or territorial loss. The idea that Portugal could hold onto its empire, this vast, glittering network of colonies, seemed increasingly improbable. But even in the face of this decline, the resistance in the colonies continued to burn. In Brazil, the fierce pushback against Portuguese rule grew stronger. Armed uprisings, fueled by the memory of years of suffering, spread across the land. Portuguese soldiers, once proud and unyielding, found themselves in battles they couldn't win. The land that had once yielded so much wealth was now fighting against them, slipping through their fingers like grains of sand. The pain of these defeats wasn't just a loss of territory, it was the loss of an empire's identity. The spirit of resistance wasn't just about people fighting for their freedom, it was about showing that even the mightiest empire couldn't keep an entire world under its thumb forever. The end of the Portuguese monopoly didn't come with a single strike or a single battle, it came slowly, through these moments of fierce resistance, of men and women, whether Portuguese or native, defying the inevitable. The world, which had once seemed to revolve around Portugal, now tilted on its axis, with the rivals closing in and the once loyal colonies slipping through their grasp. The struggle for supremacy wasn't just a war on the battlefield. It was a war for the soul of the empire, for the very idea that one nation could rule the seas, the lands, and the people of the world. The resistance, whether from a rival empire or a native population, was a reminder that no power, no matter how vast, could hold its dominance forever. The crown was heavy, a weight that no one could have predicted would fall upon the shoulders of Portugal. In the streets of Lisbon, the city had fallen silent, as though the air itself had paused in uncertainty. For years, Portugal had stood on its own, proud and independent, navigating the world with its ships slicing through uncharted seas, and its empire stretching across continents. But in 1580, everything changed in an instant. Portugal, a proud kingdom, was now bound to Spain, a union forged not by choice, but by the crushing weight of fate. It was as though the pulse of the nation had been stilled. The sound of the waves crashing on the shores seemed more distant, as if the very ocean had lost its rhythm. In the absence of a king, Philip II of Spain claimed the throne of Portugal, bringing the two kingdoms under one crown. For a people who had once been fiercely independent, the decision was an insult that cut deep. The Portuguese felt the sting of losing their own voice, their own future, to a distant monarch with his own interests and ambitions. They were not simply ruled by another king, they were now strangers in their own land, subjects of a vast empire that seemed to have forgotten them. The empire that had once been Portugal's pride was now a pawn in a game of royal politics. Its colonies, spread across the globe, were no longer under the guidance of Portuguese hands, but rather, they fell into the bureaucratic machinery of Spanish administration. From Brazil to the Spice Islands, from the shores of Africa to the coast of India, the reverberations of the Iberian Union were felt deeply. The vibrant life that had once coursed through Lisbon's trade routes and colonial ports began to wither under the weight of foreign oversight. The Portuguese colonies, those lands that had been built on the dreams of explorers and traders, now found themselves caught in the web of Spain's interests, their fates no longer their own. In Brazil, the situation was especially dire. The wealth that had once poured from the sugar plantations and gold mines now became a tool of Spanish policy. Spanish governors, unfamiliar with the vastness of Portuguese lands, began to impose their own rules, their own taxes. The once thriving Portuguese system of trade and economy began to stall. The native peoples who had resisted Portuguese control before now found themselves in the throes of an empire that had no real understanding of their needs or desires. The plantations, the heart of Brazil's wealth, struggled under the direction of distant Spanish administrators who cared little for the delicate balance that Portugal had so carefully built. In the far reaches of India and Africa, Portuguese trading posts were stripped of their autonomy, left to struggle in the wake of Spanish indifference. Yet, amidst the despair, a quiet flame of resistance began to smolder. The people of Portugal, though scattered and broken by their loss, refused to surrender their spirit. The cry for freedom, for the return of their independence, did not die. In the heart of Lisbon, in the dusty corners of their colonies, a whisper began. It was a call to arms, a call to fight for the nation that had been stolen from them. The Restoration War was inevitable. The battle to reclaim what had been lost was not just about the return of a throne, it was a battle for the soul of Portugal. For 60 long years, the kingdom had endured under Spanish rule, but the desire for freedom had never truly vanished. The spirit of independence that had fueled Portugal's empire was too strong to be extinguished. In 1640, the Portuguese people, tired of being silenced and forgotten, rose up in revolt. The streets of Lisbon once again became the site of fierce struggle. The cry for freedom rang through the city, louder than ever before. It wasn't just the nobility or the soldiers who took up arms, it was the people. From the merchants in the marketplaces to the farmers in the fields, the citizens of Portugal took a stand. They fought not just for their lands or their wealth, they fought for their identity, for the pride that had once been theirs and theirs alone. The Restoration War was not easy. For every victory, there was a loss. For every triumph, there was a bitter reminder of the toll it took. The Spanish, though weakened and stretched thin by their own conflicts, fought fiercely to hold on to what they had gained. The battles raged on, and with each passing day, the people of Portugal grew more determined. They knew that this was more than just a military struggle, it was a battle for the future of their children, for their hopes, their dreams, and their place in the world. And then, in 1640, after years of struggle, the unthinkable happened. The crown that had once been forcibly placed upon Spain's head was returned. The streets of Lisbon erupted in joy. The long night of oppression had ended. Portugal was free once more. The monarchy, which had once been stripped from them, was restored, and the nation stood tall again, reborn from the ashes of its defeat. The fire of independence burned brightly, and the Portuguese people celebrated not just the return of their crown, but the return of their pride, their soul. But the scars of those years were not so easily erased. The impact of the Iberian Union and its aftermath would forever shape the course of Portugal's history. The colonies, once so vibrant and prosperous under their own rule, would need to rebuild. The trust between the Portuguese people and their leaders, weakened by the long years of Spanish rule, would take time to mend. The royal court, which had once been the center of a proud and ambitious empire, now stood at a crossroads, its path uncertain. The world had changed, and the Portuguese people would have to find their place within it once again. In the years that followed, the Restoration War became a story of resilience, of a nation that had been knocked down but refused to stay down. It was a reminder that even when the darkest clouds seemed to have settled over a people, there was always a flicker of light, a spark of hope, waiting to burst forth and reclaim the future. For Portugal, the return of its independence was not just the restoration of a crown, it was the restoration of its spirit. The heart of the nation beat strong once more, louder than ever before. The sound of distant bells rang faintly through the cobblestone streets, their tone a shadow of the once proud chorus that had echoed through Lisbon. The world had shifted, and so too had Portugal. The empire that had once spanned across the oceans, its ships filled with gold, spices, and untold treasures, was now a shadow of its former self. In the grand halls of Lisbon's palaces, whispers of discontent and frustration were growing louder, though they often went unnoticed by those who had lived in comfort for far too long. The vibrant heart of Portugal's empire was now fraying at the edges, held together by the thinnest of threads. For decades, the Portuguese had built their empire through sheer will and ambition. They had sailed through uncharted waters, navigated storms both on the sea and in politics, and claimed vast lands that stretched across the globe. But now, the very system that had brought Portugal glory was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own excess. Corruption spread like a disease through the empire's veins, poisoning its institutions and silencing the voices of those who once fought for a brighter future. In the once thriving markets of Lisbon, there was a growing sense of unease. The riches that had once flowed so freely now seemed more distant, harder to grasp. Traders whispered of failed deals, of promises unkept, and of a nation that no longer seemed capable of holding onto the riches it had once amassed with such ease. But it wasn't just the internal rot that threatened to unravel the empire. The world outside was changing, too. Ships no longer followed the old routes, the ones that had taken Portugal's merchants from the shores of Brazil to the markets of India. New powers were rising, their ships cutting through the oceans faster, their empires spreading across new continents. The rise of new trade routes and the birth of the Industrial Revolution had shifted the balance of power. The world that Portugal had once dominated was quickly becoming unrecognizable. The very ocean that had once connected their empire now seemed to divide them from the rest of the world. While new powers were harnessing the forces of industry, Portugal's empire clung to old ways, its infrastructure crumbling under the weight of change. The once profitable colonies of Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique were slipping through Portugal's fingers, the resources that once flowed so freely now becoming harder to control. Rival powers, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, moved swiftly to claim what was slipping away. It was as though the empire was slowly being chipped away, piece by piece. In the distant lands of Africa and South America, the Portuguese faced mounting challenges as local leaders rose against foreign domination, and European rivals pressed in on all sides. The golden days when Portugal had been the undisputed master of the seas were becoming a distant memory. Back in Lisbon, the monarchy struggled to keep control. The nobility, once revered, were now nothing more than distant figures who watched as their empire crumbled from within. The heart of the empire had been divided into factions, each pulling in a different direction, each more concerned with personal gain than the health of the nation. The people, too, had grown weary. They had seen the rise and fall of so many great empires before them, and now they wondered, would Portugal, too, become a mere footnote in the history books? The once bustling docks of Lisbon, where the ships had once arrived laden with spices and gold, now seemed eerily empty. The long-awaited goods from far-flung colonies no longer arrived in the numbers they once had. The empire's power had been built on its ability to control trade, to profit from the flow of goods between continents. But now, new players in the global market were dominating the game. The world was no longer at the mercy of Portugal's empire, the tide had shifted. Inside the grand palaces of Lisbon, the king and his advisors sat in the shadows of a crumbling empire. They spoke of how to regain the lost territories, how to restore the glory of old, but it all seemed like whispers in the wind. The Industrial Revolution had taken hold, and Portugal had missed the boat. Their once powerful navy was outdated, their resources stretched thin, and their colonies were too far away to maintain. The vast territories they had claimed were no longer sources of untold wealth, but burdens that demanded more than Portugal could give. But the most painful blow of all came from the loss of Brazil. Once, it had been the jewel of the empire, the source of immense wealth from its sugar plantations, its gold mines, and its vast lands. Brazil had been the lifeblood of the empire, but now, it too was slipping away. The Brazilian people, tired of foreign rule, began to rise against their Portuguese overlords. They fought not just for freedom, but for the chance to forge their own future. The cries of rebellion filled the air, and soon, the dream of a unified empire was shattered. Portugal's influence in Africa was slipping too. The Portuguese had once controlled vast portions of the African coast, using it as a gateway to trade and expand their empire. But local resistance was growing stronger, and European rivals were swooping in to claim what Portugal had lost. The once mighty empire found itself outmaneuvered at every turn, its wealth no longer enough to keep pace with the rapidly changing world. As the 19th century unfolded, the empire's economic decline mirrored its political fragmentation. The people of Portugal, once proud of their heritage, now found themselves questioning what had gone wrong. The world had passed them by, and now they were left in the wake of a revolution they could neither join nor control. The once proud empire was no more, its influence fading into the past. And yet, amidst the decay, there were still those who refused to accept the end. As the shadows of the empire grew longer, some clung to the hope that Portugal could one day rise again, that the spirit of adventure, the thirst for discovery, and the pride of their nation would one day return. But for now, the empire that had once stretched across the oceans was no more. The world had moved on, leaving Portugal to wrestle with its own decline, a slow and heartbreaking process that would change the course of history forever. The sun had barely risen over Lisbon, but the streets already hummed with energy. In the cafes, men whispered about the latest political rumblings, casting anxious glances at the horizon as though expecting something to burst forth. Outside the city, the remains of an empire, long past its glory days, seemed to teeter on the edge of oblivion. The great colonial territories that Portugal once ruled with an iron fist were slipping away, like grains of sand through trembling fingers. It had been generations since the days when Portuguese ships ruled the seas, when the empire stretched from Brazil to the shores of Africa, to the corners of Asia. In the halls of power, the last echoes of that ambition seemed to reverberate, but those who once held it in their hands were now powerless to stop the inevitable. The world had changed, and so too had the heart of the empire. In the far corners of the world, in the villages and towns that had once been dominated by Portuguese rule, a new fire burned, one of resistance, of independence. The world had moved on. The colonies that once belonged to Portugal, to Spain, and to the other European empires, were awakening to their own dreams. From the heat of the African savannas to the jungles of Southeast Asia, independence movements took shape, fueled by years of oppression, exploitation, and the quiet but unyielding belief that freedom was a right, not a privilege reserved for the powerful. One by one, nations that had long been held in colonial chains began to break free. For Portugal, this awakening was painful, a slow unraveling of what had once been so secure. In Africa, Angola and Mozambique became the battlegrounds where dreams of freedom and justice collided with the harsh reality of Portuguese imperialism. The people, having suffered decades of brutality, finally rose up. Their cries for freedom were met with resistance from the old guard, but it was clear, the power that Portugal had once wielded so effortlessly was fading. The struggle for independence was not a momentary burst of violence, but a long, drawn-out fight for dignity, for the chance to be more than what the empire had made them. For decades, the blood of those who fought for liberty stained the earth, while Portugal, still reeling from the loss of its other colonies, scrambled to hold on. In Asia, the story was no different. The Portuguese, once masters of the spice trade, found themselves increasingly irrelevant as former colonies in India and beyond moved towards self-rule. The world had changed, and so had the people. The sense of colonial superiority that once buoyed the empire was fading, replaced by the sharp, undeniable reality that the people in these distant lands were no longer willing to bow to foreign rulers. Independence movements in Asia were gaining momentum, and Portugal found itself desperately clinging to its crumbling possessions. As the decades dragged on, the Portuguese people at home could no longer ignore the writing on the wall. In the streets of Lisbon, there was growing unrest, a sense of helplessness in the air. Those who had lived through the empire's golden years watched in silence as the last remnants of their once proud possession slipped away. Portugal had lost much of its political and economic power, and the world seemed to be marching toward a new era. But those who lived within its borders still held on to something intangible, something that refused to let go, the idea that the empire had meant something more than just a series of distant colonies. It wasn't just the loss of territories that shook Portugal to its core. The economic burden of maintaining an empire, stretched across oceans and continents, had drained the country of its resources. Corruption was rampant, and poverty ran deep. The political system that had supported the empire for centuries was now crumbling under the weight of its own failures. Portugal could no longer keep up with the rapid changes occurring across Europe and the world. The promise of empire had long been out of reach. But even as the empire crumbled, hope was rising in unexpected places. In 1974, as the sun set on yet another day of political instability in Portugal, a spark ignited that would change everything. The people, weary of the suffering and oppression that had been their lot for so long, took to the streets in a peaceful rebellion. It was a revolution unlike any that had come before, one that would not be stained by blood or violence. Instead, it was marked by coronations, red flowers handed out by the citizens, signaling that the battle for change could be fought without firing a single shot. The Carnation Revolution was a quiet storm, one that swept through the streets of Lisbon and beyond. It was a turning point for Portugal, the moment when the old guard that had ruled for centuries finally gave way to a new order. The revolutionaries, fueled by the anger and frustration of years of authoritarian rule, did not just seek to overthrow a government. They sought to erase the legacy of a system that had once been built on the subjugation of others, on the exploitation of colonies and people. The echoes of Portugal's empire were finally being silenced by the will of the people. As the revolution unfolded, there was no grand, triumphant moment, only the quiet, relentless shift in power. The old regime fell, and with it, the last vestiges of an empire that had ruled the world for centuries. The people of Portugal could finally breathe again, knowing that their future would no longer be shaped by the ghosts of their past. In the aftermath of the revolution, the world that Portugal once knew was gone. The colonies in Africa, Asia, and South America had long since gained their independence, and Portugal was now a small nation, struggling to find its place in a new, post-imperial world. The rich, colorful tapestry of its former empire had been replaced by the stark realities of the modern world, where new powers had risen to take the place of the old colonial powers. But the revolution was not just about the end of empire. It was about the end of an era, the moment when Portugal's people stood together and said, "No more." No more could they live in the shadows of their past, no more could they carry the weight of an empire that had long since ceased to be relevant. The Carnation Revolution was their way of reclaiming their future, of standing tall once again, free from the legacy of colonialism and the oppression that had once been a part of their identity. As the last remnants of empire slipped away, Portugal was left to rebuild. The world had changed, and so had they. The vibrant streets of São Paulo pulse with life as the sun dips below the horizon. The smell of fresh pão de queijo drifts from nearby cafes, and the sounds of samba, with its rhythmic beats, spill into the night air. The people, whether their roots are deep in the soil of Brazil, drawn from the shores of Africa, or spread across the vastness of Europe, move to the same rhythm, their languages and stories woven together in ways that have never quite unraveled. The moment is a perfect representation of what centuries of exchange, struggle, and survival have created, a unique, intricate tapestry of culture that stretches from the favelas of Brazil to the port cities of Mozambique to the islands of Macau. In Brazil, the Portuguese language is sung in the lilting tones of a samba dancer's voice, but it carries with it echoes of the African languages spoken by those once forcibly brought across the ocean. It's a rhythm in the heart of the land, a blending that neither erases the past nor silences the struggles. Instead, it becomes a new language, a new way of speaking, thinking, and feeling. The marriage of the indigenous and African cultures with European traditions wasn't always peaceful, but it was undeniable. What began as a forced fusion of languages and practices evolved into something uniquely Brazilian, forming the very fabric of a national identity. And it wasn't just Brazil. Across the empire's vast territories, from Angola to Goa, the Portuguese presence left behind traces that still resonate. In the bustling markets of Luanda, vendors call out in a mix of Portuguese and local languages, offering wares that have traveled from distant lands, their wares a perfect symbol of syncretism. There's a local rhythm in their words, but it's touched by something else, something foreign. The fusion of African, European, and even Asian elements in food, religion, and customs created something fresh, something never before seen in the world. The colors, sounds, and smells of this exchange formed a deep, living bond between cultures that would last long after the empire's fall. Perhaps most striking was the way the Portuguese Empire changed religion. Catholicism, introduced by the Jesuits and missionaries, didn't simply impose itself on the populations it encountered, it blended with the beliefs, rituals, and traditions of indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. In Brazil, for instance, candomblé emerged as a powerful syncretic religion that combined Catholic saints with African deities, a testament to the resilience and adaptability of people who refused to be defined by their conquerors. In Angola, the echoes of indigenous beliefs merged with Catholicism to create a form of spiritual practice that still exists today. What the Portuguese intended to convert, the people made their own, transforming religion into something that transcended the original intentions of colonization. As the Portuguese spread their reach, their language, once a tool of power, became a bridge that connected different parts of the world. Today, Portuguese is spoken by millions, not just in Portugal, but in Brazil, Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and beyond. The beauty of this language is in its sound, its rhythm, its ability to carry emotion and history in every word. It is a language that holds within it centuries of shared struggle, laughter, and pain. It is a language of empire, yes, but also one of resistance and renewal. It is a reminder that language, even one forced upon people, has the power to adapt, to survive, and to become something completely new. Art was another vessel that carried the influence of Portuguese colonization across continents. In Brazil, the fusion of African traditions with European artistic styles gave birth to a distinct and powerful visual language that became the soul of Brazilian art. Painters like Tarsila do Amaral began to reflect this blending of cultures, pulling from European modernism, but infusing it with local colors, symbols, and themes. The landscapes of Brazil, the culture of its people, and the legacy of colonization were painted into existence, combining indigenous, African, and Portuguese influences in a vivid, emotional expression. In Africa, too, art was transformed by the cultural crosscurrents. Portuguese influence mingled with local traditions, producing a wide array of styles and mediums that still shine today in museums and markets across the continent. From the masks and sculptures of West Africa, shaped by centuries of Portuguese interactions, to the intricate beadwork of Angola, art became a shared language that crossed boundaries, both geographical and cultural. In Goa, the influence of the Portuguese presence still lingers in the churches that dot the landscape, their architecture a beautiful fusion of European and local styles. The ornate decorations inside the churches, often laden with symbolism, represent not just the Catholic faith, but the blending of indigenous belief systems with the religion brought by the missionaries. The Portuguese built more than just churches in Goa, they built a cultural legacy that infused the region's cuisine, music, and festivals, creating something deeply Portuguese and yet distinctly Goan. Even now, the festivals, like Carnival, with their loud, jubilant celebrations, are reminders of the cultural exchange that has taken place for centuries. While art and language were vital parts of this cultural mixing, it was the food that perhaps tells the most direct story of the empire's reach. The Portuguese brought with them new crops, new cooking techniques, and new spices. These weren't just ingredients, they were symbols of the empire's expanse, carried in the holds of ships across oceans, traded with far-flung corners of the world. But those ingredients didn't just stay confined to the kitchens of Europe. They began to mix with indigenous and African ingredients, giving rise to the fiery curries of India, the rich stews of Brazil, and the aromatic dishes of Mozambique. Each plate, each dish, told a story of cultures meeting, mingling, and becoming something more than they were separately. Yet, despite the overwhelming presence of Portuguese influence, the empires that once commanded the seas were never able to completely suppress the cultures they encountered. What began as a conquest of power through religion, trade, and colonization was transformed into something far greater. The people who were conquered, enslaved, and marginalized took what they were given and made it their own. They used the language of the empire to speak of their own truths. They turned the religion of the conquerors into something that reflected their own beliefs. They shaped the art, the food, the music, and the very culture into a rich tapestry that couldn't be unraveled. The legacy of the Portuguese Empire is not just in the buildings they left behind or the vast lands they once claimed. It is in the languages spoken today, the foods enjoyed, the art created, and the religions practiced. It is in the quiet, everyday lives of people who carry within them the story of a long and complicated history. And it is a legacy that continues to evolve as cultures and identities shift and change, blending into something new, something powerful, something that stands tall against the storms of history. The ship groans as it cuts through the waves, carrying its passengers across the vast, unrelenting ocean. The sky is an endless stretch of blue, and below, the water churns with an eerie calmness that matches the uncertainty of the journey. On board, there are families, men, women, children, people leaving behind everything they've ever known. Their reasons for departure are as varied as the stars above: the hope of a better life, the chance of starting anew, or perhaps the weight of a world that's no longer theirs to hold. It was a journey that would forever change the lives of those aboard, even if they didn't know it yet. They were Portuguese, but they were about to become something else entirely, something that would straddle both worlds, the old and the new, the colonial past and the uncertain future. When the Portuguese left their homeland to settle in distant lands, they didn't just bring their families, they carried with them fragments of their culture, their language, their ways of life. Over the years, these fragments would mix with those of other peoples, indigenous populations, African slaves, and others who had crossed paths with the empire's far-reaching arms. As the generations passed, the children of these settlers became more than just Portuguese, they became part of the fabric of the countries they had come to call home. Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, their stories were now intertwined with those who had lived there long before the Portuguese arrived. The cities of Brazil, now filled with the clamor of millions, stand as reminders of the millions of Portuguese who journeyed across the ocean. And as the years have gone by, they've become homes not just for the descendants of the settlers, but for the descendants of everyone who had ever touched those shores. There are no longer clear lines between who was born Portuguese and who wasn't. In Brazil, in Angola, in Mozambique, the past is both a wound and a bond, a shared history, sometimes painful, but always present. The language of those who first made the journey, the rhythm of Portuguese, echoes through the streets of Sao Paulo, Luanda, Maputo. It is a language that has traveled far from its origins, carrying with it the weight of history, but also the lightness of everyday life. In Brazil, the Portuguese spoken is now wrapped in the music of samba, the sense of feijoada and maquica, and the fierce pride of a nation that has grown into its own. In Mozambique and Angola, it has become a tool for communication and identity, but it also stands as a symbol of resilience. It is the link that ties the past to the present, the thread that connects generations, keeping alive the memory of ancestors who crossed oceans to build new futures. But as time has passed, the migration has gone both ways. The descendants of those who once left Portugal have come back, finding themselves in a world far removed from the colonial power they once were a part of. Yet Portugal, though smaller, has never truly lost its connection to the lands it once ruled. The Portuguese diaspora has kept these bonds alive, whether through trade, education, or simply the ties of family. Children born in Mozambique, Angola, or Brazil may travel to Portugal to study, to learn more about the roots that have been woven into the tapestry of their own identities. The relationship is not without its complexities. On the one hand, there are the wounds of the past, where the scars of colonization are still felt in the social, political, and economic struggles of many Lusophone nations. The Portuguese Empire may have crumbled, but its legacy is still palpable, sometimes painfully so. In Brazil, where the history of slavery and its aftermath continue to shape the nation's struggles with race and inequality, there are those who still wrestle with what it means to be both Portuguese and Brazilian. Similarly, Angola and Mozambique, nations rich in resources and culture, carry the heavy weight of their colonial past as they continue to work toward their own national identities. And yet, in the face of these struggles, something profound endures. A shared language binds these countries together, despite the geographical distance, despite the centuries of colonial rule that separated them. The ties between Portugal and its former colonies are not just about trade or politics. They are about shared histories, families that span continents, and an enduring connection that cannot be severed by time or distance. Modern-day Angola, Mozambique, and Brazil are not just Lusophone nations in name, they are living, breathing testaments to a world that, though shaped by history, continues to evolve. The importance of the Portuguese diaspora can be seen in the cultural exchanges that occur daily. Whether it's the thriving Portuguese-speaking communities in Sao Paulo or the influence of Brazilian culture in Lisbon, the flow of ideas, music, and art between Portugal and its former colonies continues to enrich both sides. In the heart of Lisbon, one can hear the rhythms of samba spilling out from a cafe, while in Luanda, the songs of fado mix with local melodies. Artists, writers, musicians, filmmakers, they are all part of a larger, global conversation, their work speaking to the shared history of a people, even when that history has been painful. The descendants of the original settlers and the indigenous populations are now part of a complex and vibrant mix in Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique. In these countries, the identity of being Portuguese is not just about the past. It's about the present, how they continue to shape and redefine what it means to be Portuguese, even as their countries assert their independence. The modern Lusophone world is no longer just about colonial power or domination, it is about an interconnectedness that has transcended the historical boundaries of empire. The stories of the past are still being told, but they are no longer being told only by the colonizers. They are being told by the descendants of those who fought, resisted, and survived. They are being told by the artists, the writers, the activists, and the thinkers who continue to challenge and reshape the legacy of the empire. In the markets of Luanda, in the streets of Maputo, in the neighborhoods of Sao Paulo, the echoes of Portugal can still be heard. But now, those echoes are not just the sounds of a colonial past, they are the sounds of a shared future. The Portuguese language, the culture, the history, they are all alive, evolving, and interwoven with the cultures of Africa and Latin America. The migration of the past has shaped the world of today, and the bonds formed by those who left, and those who remained, continue to grow stronger. They are no longer just the remnants of empire, they are the building blocks of something new. The walls of an ancient port city echo with whispers of the past. A child runs along cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, oblivious to the layers of history beneath their feet. Merchants once traded spices here, voices mingling in a cacophony of languages. The air, thick with salt and the scent of forgotten stories, carries a question unspoken but felt, what remains of an empire after it has faded? This is the dilemma of memory. For some, the empire is a source of pride, an era of discovery and achievement, a tale of daring explorers who carved new paths across uncharted waters. For others, it is a weight too heavy to bear, a reminder of lives uprooted, lands exploited, and cultures reshaped. In these streets, museums, and books, the story of the Portuguese Empire continues to be told, but how it is told depends on who is holding the pen. Centuries have passed, but the memories of the empire linger like the faint trace of an old shipwreck beneath calm waters. In classrooms across Portugal, students learn of Vasco da Gama's journeys, of the wealth and influence their small nation once wielded. The maps in these lessons are bold and bright, stretching across continents. But elsewhere, the stories look different. In Angola, Mozambique, and Brazil, history is remembered through the lens of resistance, resilience, and reclamation. For the people whose ancestors were caught in the tide of colonialism, the empire is not just history, it is inheritance. The fields where slaves once toiled, the towns reshaped by missionaries, the families divided by the whims of commerce, these are not distant echoes. They live on in every corner of modern Lusophone nations. And yet, there is beauty in the way these countries have turned pain into art, into music, into culture. It is a paradox. The same empire that oppressed them also became a thread in their identity. The moral weight of this legacy presses heavily on those who dare to reflect on it. Was it worth it? This question, simple yet devastating, reverberates in the minds of scholars, activists, and everyday people. Was the gold extracted from Brazilian mines worth the lives of the indigenous people displaced? Was the trade in spices worth the human cost of the enslaved Africans who were sold like goods in the markets? These are not questions with answers, they are burdens to carry. The empire's architects likely never considered these questions. They were men of their time, driven by ambition, greed, and the conviction that they were doing what was right for their nation and their faith. But history judges differently. Looking back, it is hard not to see the cracks in their vision, the humanity they failed to see in those they conquered, the voices they silenced in their pursuit of greatness. In the present, those cracks have widened into chasms. Monuments that once celebrated explorers now provoke debates. Should they stand as reminders of a proud heritage, or should they be dismantled as symbols of oppression? Streets named after colonial governors spark protests, their legacies no longer accepted without question. In Portugal itself, a reckoning is underway. The empire, once a source of national pride, is now a subject of introspection. Museums host exhibitions not just of golden artifacts, but also of the stories behind them, stories of exploitation, suffering, and resilience. But this reflection is not limited to monuments or museums. It is found in literature, where authors wrestle with the duality of their histories. It is in music, where rhythms born of Africa mix with Portuguese melodies to create something wholly unique. And it is in the faces of people who carry the empire's legacy in their blood, descendants of settlers, slaves, and indigenous peoples, all woven together into a complex tapestry. The questions do not end with morality. There are also lessons to learn, lessons about how power shapes the world and how empires, no matter how mighty, eventually crumble. The Portuguese Empire was among the first global empires, but it was not the last. Its rise and fall offer a warning to all who seek dominion over others. Power is fleeting, but the consequences endure. As nations grapple with these lessons, there is also hope. The painful history of the empire has given way to something unexpected, a global network of Lusophone nations united not by conquest, but by shared culture, language, and aspirations. Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, East Timor, they are no longer colonies but sovereign nations. And Portugal, though small, continues to find its place in this community, offering solidarity and partnership instead of domination. The reflection on empire is not just about the past, it is about the future. What kind of world do we want to build, knowing what we now know? How can nations that were once colonizers and colonies work together in a way that is just and equitable? These questions are not easy, but they are necessary. The empire's story is still being written, not in the halls of power but in the hearts of people. It is in the Angolan musician blending traditional rhythms with modern beats, and the Brazilian poet writing about the pain and joy of her mixed heritage, and the Portuguese historian who spends her days untangling the complexities of the past. These are the storytellers who will shape how the empire is remembered, not as a single narrative, but as a mosaic of experiences, each as valid as the next. The sun sets on the port city, casting long shadows across its ancient walls. The child playing in the streets pauses, watching as the light fades. They do not yet know the weight of the history beneath their feet, but one day, they will. And when they do, they will decide what to carry forward and what to leave behind. For the story of the Portuguese Empire is not over, it lives on in the choices we make, the stories we tell, and the futures we dare to imagine.